All right. Yeah, thank you so much. Welcome to my talk. So today I'm going to be talking about Next.js on AWS. My name is Nader Dabit. I'm a senior developer advocate on the AWS mobile team. These days I focus a lot on AWS Amplify and AWS AppSync and Managed GraphQL Service. By trade, I'm a web and mobile developer, so like a front-end developer, and I am also an author. And my most recent book is Full Stack Serverless. So if you're interested in some of the stuff I'm talking about, that book is available today from O'Reilly Publications. So let's go ahead and jump right in. When we're talking about working with Next.js on AWS, there's really two main pieces or parts to kind of compartmentalize and think about. First of all, there's the deployment of a Next app onto the AWS ecosystem or into the AWS ecosystem. So the deployment itself and the things that go along with what Next.js has to offer. And then there's the APIs and kind of working with these APIs in a server rendered environment or a statically generated page. So we're going to be talking about both of these. And to kind of understand those better, let's first kind of take a step back and look at what Next.js is and kind of how Next.js works. So Next.js, at the most fundamental description, could be described as a web framework built with React. But if you've ever used Next.js, or you probably even haven't used Next.js, you probably know it's a lot more than that. So let's think about what happens when you build a typical React application. We go to the command line and we run npx create react app. What we're given is a single page application. We typically have a div and we write a bunch of JavaScript. That JavaScript is bundled up and then served into a single bundle onto that div. And what we're given is client-side routing. We have client-side rendering. And what we're given is essentially a single page application. So one of the things that Next.js brings to the table is this idea of pre-rendering HTML. And it does so really well in a couple of different ways. So at first, Next.js offered this idea of server-side rendering and client-side rendering kind of together. And then recently, it's actually added and improved the static site generation, the support for static site generation. So using Next.js, you have the opportunity to do client-side rendering, but also pre-rendering of HTML on the server or in a statically site-generated like build phase. So kind of all three of these put together. So let's talk about what this idea of pre-rendering HTML is and like why it's good. Well, first of all, it brings to the table speed and performance. Typically, you're going to be serving these types of apps from the edge. So you can kind of have all these edge locations. And also, if you're working with a lot of statically generated pages, you're going to be just working with raw HTML anyway. The SEO is a lot better with these types of apps. And then by default, out of the box, you're going to get much better scalability and resiliency. But when you're working with pre-rendered HTML in a statically generated site or a statically generated page versus a server-rendered page, it actually works a little differently. So for a static site, the pre-rendering is going to be done in a build step. So the HTML is going to be kind of created before or in some type of step when you're kind of building your app or incrementally after you've built your app. And then you have this HTML that can just be served at the edge via some CDN. And if you have any data that you need, it's typically prefetched. And this data is probably not going to be user-specific because it's going to be built without any type of authorization kind of mechanisms built in. And then you also have the idea of server-rendered HTML. And this HTML is typically done on demand. So kind of you hit this endpoint and or you hit some route, and then the server is going to render the page into HTML on that request. And to do this, you actually have to have some type of runtime execution. And this can be done on a server or a serverless environment, a serverless function. What you're typically seeing now is this done in a serverless manner. So then begs the question, and to me, this was kind of the first confusing part when I first started learning this, was like, which one should I use? Should I use a server render or should I use a statically generated page? Well, it makes it a lot easier now when you go to the docs. They actually tell you what they recommend. And this is directly from the Next.js docs. We recommend using static generation over server-side rendering for performance reason. Statically generated pages can be cached by CDN with no extra configuration to boost performance. However, in some cases, server-side rendering might be the only option. So how do you go about deciding and understanding how each of these is going to work? Well, when you're building with Next.js, it actually is now pretty opinionated. So by default, your page is going to be actually a statically generated page. So let's just say you go and you create a new file in your pages directory, about.js, and you create an About Us page, and then you run npm run dev, or you npm run build. That's going to be a statically generated page by default. You can also use some of the methods to kind of do additional things during this build process. So you have this get static props function that you can export. And what this is going to basically do, it's going to be something that runs and allows you to kind of fetch data and then pass it down as props into your page. This is kind of a static site generated function that you can work with. There's also get static paths. So if you've ever worked with something like Gatsby, you may have had understood that you have that Node.js build step where you kind of have all of those different hooks that you can kind of like hook into, and one of them allowed you to kind of create pages. Well, you can also do this using get static paths with Next.js. And here you might make an API call, and then based on that data, you might map through an array and then create like a new page or a new path, I guess you could say, for each of the items there. And then you might combine get static paths with get static props based on the data that you get from those API calls. Now, what about working with server rendered pages? So if you want to opt into a server-side rendered page, you can use get server-side props. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to basically allow you to export this function, and then Next.js will pre-render this page on every request using the data that is kind of returned by get server-side props. And this is going to be something that you can do to pass props into your page based on this function that's going to run before the page is rendered. And then you also have API routes, and these are always going to be server rendered. So the coolest thing to me one of the coolest things to me are these API routes. So it's just like a really easy way to kind of create these API routes. So how do you kind of understand a little bit better how all this stuff works? Well, let's take a look at the scripts that come out of the box with your app. So you have this dev script, and when you run this, you're essentially kind of just running a dev server, and you can kind of test out everything in your app. When you're ready to deploy, you can run your build script. And this is going to be something you can either run locally or as part of some of your CI or CD process. And then you can then run the start command, which will take that build and then run that locally or wherever you would like to run that. So dev is just going to kind of run what you have. You can then build and then start that if you'd like to kind of test it out. And then you also have this option if you want to completely opt out of any API routes, you want to opt out of any server rendering, and you just want this static site generation, you can use the next export. And this is going to say, okay, I know for sure I don't want any server rendered stuff. I just want static site generated stuff. And this is really useful for hosting providers that only support static site generation, or for apps that know they don't need any server-side rendering. So if you only want to buy into Next.js for the static site generation piece, then you can use this export command, and this is going to only do static site generation. And one of the great things that one of the things that I really like about Next.js is the feedback that it gives you in the CLI. So when you create a build or you are kind of working with an environment that you're like not unsure about, you can actually see the output from the build and understand how each page is working and a little bit of info about each page. So you have this little legend at the bottom that has the lambda for a server. It has the round circle that's not filled in for static, and then it has the round circle that is filled in for a server-generated page. So here we're seeing that the main index page, like the main entry point, is a statically generated page. We then also see that our about page is a server-generated page because we must have used a get server-side props there for whatever reason, and therefore it's a server-rendered page. And then we also see that, okay, not only is our contact page statically generated, but we did use get static props for whatever reason there, so we kind of know what's going on there. So once you run your build, you can kind of look through and see exactly what's going on in your app. So now that we kind of have a general idea about like how Next.js works, let's now look at how we can deploy Next.js onto AWS. Now, when we're talking about deployments, we're typically thinking about them in a couple of different ways. First of all, how do we deploy a statically generated page? Well, for the most part, we want our statically generated pages to be served from edge locations because we want to buy into that low latency and cost. We want that resiliency, that scalability, and the security, everything that kind of comes along with that. We probably want our assets and our static and our public folders to be also served from these edge locations automatically. As far as server rendered pages, we definitely want to buy into this whole ecosystem. So we want to be able to have access to things like get server-side props. We want our API routes. We probably want our API routes to be also served from the edge. And pages that do need server-side compute to render, we also want those hosted at the edge. So how can we kind of accomplish all this and do so using AWS? So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to host a Next app on AWS. First of all, we're going to look at AWS Amplify. Now, at the moment, AWS Amplify does not support SSR or API routes. So if you want to use AWS Amplify with Next.js, it's going to be in the context of a statically generated site. In a few months, we're going to be releasing SSR support as well. But for now, you're typically going to be working with Amplify console and Amplify hosting in the context of a statically generated site. Now, how does that look and how do you get up and running with it? You can either use Git-based deployments using your GitHub repo, or you can use the CLI. You can run Amplify add hosting, and this will kind of walk you through a few steps and you're ready to roll. You'll also need to update your build script to add the next export command, because if you're going to be, again, using Amplify console at the moment, it is going to be a statically generated site. So you need to kind of run this script as part of the build process. Now, the most robust support for Next.js, though, comes from the serverless framework and the serverless Next.js component. This will actually buy into the entire Next.js ecosystem and kind of wire everything up for you, and it's a really nice experience to kind of get up and running right now. All you basically need to do is create a new serverless application using the serverless CLI, set up a couple of fields here. So you need to kind of set the name of your app and then a component field. And then for the component field, you're just going to use a serverless next serverless component at the current version. So at the moment of this recording, that's 1.16.0. So for this example, I kind of want to go ahead and do a demo here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead into a Next.js application that I've already created. And what I want to do is say npx serverless creates, and I'm going to say template AWS Node.js. And this is going to go ahead and create a new serverless project within our Next app. So if I go now and I do an ls, I see I have a handler.js, and I see I have a serverless YAML. So what we want to do is open up that serverless YAML. And this is going to be where we kind of write our code. Now, I don't need any of that, actually. All I want to do is say Next.js app react.js or something like that. And here I'm going to have a component. And this is going to be that serverless component. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this to make sure I don't get anything wrong in my live demo. Save that. And now we're ready to deploy. So what I can do now is go here and run npx serverless. So we'll go ahead and run that. And this will go ahead and provision and deploy everything. Now, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to be getting an app URL. So let's go ahead and open up a browser window so we can test this out once it's given to us. So here we are with our app URL. We'll go ahead and paste that here. And then we see our next app running there. So now let's go ahead and test out our API route. So I'm going to go to API/hello. And there we see that our response is coming back. The next thing we might want to do is maybe make an update. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our API, and I'll go ahead and create a new file, and I'll maybe call this speakers.js, and maybe this will be kind of like an API for some type of conference or something like that. What we might do is have like an array of speakers. So we might have, say, speakers is equal to an array, and then each one has like a name. And then for the response, we might just have like the speakers or something like that. So now we have a new speakers endpoint. And to deploy that, I can just run npx serverless. And this should go ahead and deploy the new update for us. So we'll give that a few seconds to finish. And after this is done, we're given our URL, and I believe that should be the exact same. So we should be able to kind of go back to our existing app. And we're going to now go to /API, and we're going to go to speakers. And I think this might take a little bit to deploy. I think because we just sent that update, the CloudFront distribution has not updated. But anyway, that will work once this is finished. So maybe we'll come back to that and check it out in just a second. But basically our API routes are working. Our deployment is working on the the serverless framework. So we've looked at deploying, and you can do a lot of other things here. You can actually continue configuring this serverless YAML to add any other configurations that you would typically think about needing for your Next.js app. But now let's move on to API interactions. So now that we've seen how to actually deploy, how can we interact with our data sources and with our authentication services from these server render pages and from these statically generated pages? Now, in the past, what we have typically enabled via the Amplify client libraries is only client interactions. So we did not enable server interactions. But something that we've just now put into a preview version, and we're going to be launching very soon, is SSR support. And to do this, all you need to do now is set an SSR configuration in your Amplify configuration, and you're ready to roll. So in our new updates, what you'll be able to do now is set an SSR flag to true, and then all of the Amplify libraries will now be able to be used in a server-side environment or a statically generated page. So let's take a closer look at that. When we're thinking about interactions, the two main interactions that you're probably going to be working with are authorization and authentication, interactions, or working with some type of data source, or a combination of the two, right? For things like fine-grained access control and things like that. So let's first look at SSR data. So if you'd like to use the API categories or any of the libraries now, via SSR or a statically generated page, everything should now just work as it used to. So you don't really have to do anything. We've just made updates to make this all work, in these environments. So you can import the API category to make a GraphQL API call. You call it api.graphql. Everything just works. But the updates, the enhancements that we're really excited about have more to do around authorization and headers and things like that. So now let's take a look at authentication and authorization. And the class that you typically work with Amplify is the auth class. So you typically would import auth on a client-side rendered page, and then you would make calls like auth.sign in and auth.sign out. What we've now introduced is this new with SSR context component, or this new SSR context with SSR context API that you can then use to make your app SSR aware. So instead of importing directly from Amplify, if you're planning on using this in an SSR environment, all you need to do is use the with SSR context hook, and then you can then destructure the auth in the API class, and then you're ready to roll. So how would that look in an actual app? So now let's look at something like SSR authentication, using the new with SSR context. Now this is an API route. So in an example like this, you might consider like why you might even need something like this. And then we'll talk about that in just a moment. But to get this working, you'll first import the with SSR context, or API from AWS Amplify. And then within the function that you're going to be using it in, you'll go ahead and destructure the auth or the API class from the with SSR context and pass in the request. And then what you'll then be able to do is just use this like you typically would. You'll be able to call auth.current authenticated user or any of the methods on the auth class. And basically what you're going to be now working with are sessions as opposed to local storage. And everything just works as you would expect. So in an environment like this, and an API route or something like this, you might think of making an API call to some backend, and you might need to know like who the current authenticated user is, and are they authorized to make this request. So an easy way to do that might be using the auth class. And then you might do something with that user data. Here I'm just kind of setting this is authenticated flag to true or false based on who this user is. And then you can also do a combination of auth and data. And when you really think about it, a lot of the power behind a lot of the Amplify client libraries come through this combination. So you sign in, and then you make an API request to one of your data sources, and we take care of setting all of the headers and things like that for you. So how do you do that on the server? Well, it's actually now all just completely taken care of for you. You don't really have to do anything other than make the component SSR aware. So let's take a look at another example. In this example, we're using the get server-side props function for a server rendered page. In this example, we go ahead and import with SSR context. We also import our GraphQL query like we normally would. In the function, we now destructure the API category off of the with SSR context. And this is automatically going to understand the currently signed in user, if there is a signed in user or not, and set the proper headers. So what we can then do is just call our GraphQL API or our REST API like we normally would. We don't have to do anything around authorization. Everything is taken care of for us. If the user is signed in, the user ID token is going to be available via the session, and we're going to take care of that for you. If there is no user, then we will, of course, not set any headers for that user at all. But essentially, it just makes everything kind of work without you really having to think about it. So in this example, we're essentially just passing down a post array as props to the myPost component. And this is done via a fetch and the get server-side props function. So what we're really working towards, and the things that we've done already and the things that we're working towards in the future, are to make Amplify work extremely first class well with Next.js. And a lot of times people start using AWS and they get excited. Next.js is like next level React. And then they find Amplify. And then they maybe mix Next.js with AWS. And what we're really trying to get to the point is Next.js and Amplify are just a killer combination. And we've already gotten a lot of the way there, but we have some other things that are coming that are really exciting over the next few months. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming to my talk, and thank you for listening to me talk about all this stuff. If you're interested in hearing more, follow me on Twitter. I'm Dabit3, D-A-B-I-T, and the number 3 on Twitter. Thank you so much.